Hey everybody, Tom Lynn here. A few years ago, I did some interviews through this organization in Cincinnati, Media Bridges, which I thought could be fruitfully thrown up here on the channel. This one is with Eric Holt-Gimenez, who is with an organization out on the West Coast, Food First, or sometimes Food First International. I think we'll link their website below. And what we're just going to talk about is a constellation of questions around food sovereignty, the relationship people have with their food, not just in terms of how they eat it, but how it's grown, how it fits into the matrix of the global economy and the local economy. So, definitely worth a lesson, I think, anyways. And I hope you enjoy. For the next hour or so, roughly, we'll be doing some radical analysis. Radical coming from the Latin word radix or root. So trying to get beneath the surface of things. And if all goes as planned, in a few moments we'll be joined on the line by Eric Holt-Gimenez of Food First, or the Institute for Food and Development Policy. They're out in California, but their work is ultimately of global significance, dealing specifically with the broad sets of injustices that give rise to hunger and other problematics associated with the food system. So while we're waiting for Eric, I thought I'd open with some anticipation of the sorts of issues to which we shall be addressing ourselves, in anticipation which was articulated in the mid-19th century by one Karl Marx. As regular listeners will know, I'm often fond of going back to Marx because he really got an amazing amount of stuff right. But I just, there are two passages I thought I'd read, sort of, I thought appropriate. I think I might sneeze here in a moment. Oh dear. But here we go. Here's one passage which comes from the very end of chapter 15, which is actually on machinery in large-scale industry. And he notes, specifically in conjunction with the development of capitalism in agriculture, that in modern agriculture, as in urban industry, the increase in the productivity and mobility of labor is purchased at the cost of laying waste and debilitating labor power itself. Moreover, all progress in capitalist agriculture is a progress in the art not only of robbing the worker, but of robbing the soil. All progress in increasing the fertility of the soil for a given time is a progress toward ruining the more long-lasting sources of that fertility. The more a country proceeds from large-scale industry as the background of its development, as in the case of the United States, the more rapid is this process of destruction. Capitalist production, therefore, only develops the techniques and degrees of combination of the social process of production by simultaneously undermining the original sources of all wealth, the soil and the worker. So that, really, I want to say is one of the, it sort of relays many of the themes which we will endeavor to address. In fact, I might reread that quote when Eric gets on the line and ask him perhaps maybe to riff on it a bit. But the other quote, which I wanted to cite, which I thought was also relevant, comes later in the text, toward the end of chapter 26. Actually, there's a great deal of material that we could draw into this, but we'll limit ourselves for the moment to these two here. And this is in the midst of his discussion of primitive accumulation, which is what capitalists do to get the money in the first place before they can avail themselves of a capitalist mode of production to acquire, appropriate profit, or more fundamentally, surplus value from which profit is derived. And in short, we're talking about the mass dispossession of the peoples of the world, and also older orders, the older aristocratic orders and so forth. When you look back to, but I think more fundamentally that the target of primitive accumulation is are going to be the poor of the world. But in any event, the passage. In the history of primitive accumulation, all revolutions are epoch making that act as levers for the capitalist class in the course of its formation. But this is true above all for those moments when great masses of men are suddenly and forcibly torn from their means of subsistence and hurled onto the labor market as free, unprotected, and rightless proletarians. The expropriation of the agricultural producer or of the peasant from the soil is the basis of the whole process. The history of this expropriation assumes different aspects in different countries and runs through its different phases in different orders of succession and at different historical epochs. And then he goes on from there. But obviously, the first passage is really the juicier one. But I bring them up because I feel that many of the problems that pertain to the world food system and global poverty and all that arise out of the dominance of the specifically capitalist mode of production. Why is that? Well, to answer that question, obviously, I'd have to go into what does the capitalist mode of production actually consist. And we talked about that a little bit last week to try and recap while we're waiting very quickly. It's a mode of production which assembles the resources available to a society and the labor of that society in a fashion which produces goods en masse for the sake of exchange, and in turn, from that exchange to effect an expropriation of surplus value. In other words, you want to try and get more while giving less. At the root, then, capitalism is in a sense an effort to evade the apparent finitude of our existence. And it seems actually, in some ways, possible because of the superabundance of nature. However, an illusion arises that superabundance arises not from nature, but from the system itself. And depending on how you are ensconced within that system, you're given more or less power, more or less primacy. And the people who are ensconced most favorably are the capitalists, the owners of the means of production, who use that ownership as leverage whence to expropriate from the broader producing population the bulk of value that they produce to their own benefit. And that is possible because of a whole culture of radical individuation, the individual trumps all and all that. That's the kind of rhetoric that is used to sort of justify this regime in conjunction with a little story about how the laborer and the capitalist meet each other on equal terms in the labor market. But it's a rather specious narrative, I would contend. And I think we've got Eric, so let's rock and roll. Hello, Eric.
Yeah, hi, this is Eric.
Hey, Eric, this is Tom. So thank you so much for calling. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, perfectly.
Excellent. So I guess we can just get right to things. I had noted to the listeners that you are the executive director of Food First International. Is that correct?
Don't call it Food First International. Just Food First, the Institute for Food and Development Policy.
All right. Maybe just as a point of departure, you could give a little précis of the sorts of questions and issues that you guys address at Food First.
Okay. Well, At Food First, we're a think tank on food and development issues. And we've been around for about 35 years now. We were started by Francis Moore Lapay and Joseph Collins, following the publication of her book, Diet for a Small Planet. And ever since that time, we've been looking at the issue of hunger and principally the contradiction, which is with us today and has been with us for over 30 years, that we have hunger in a bountiful world. And for the past 4 decades, in fact, the world has always produced enough food to feed everybody, 1.5 times over. But hunger has been growing. In other words, there's enough food per capita to feed everyone, but not everybody gets the food. And that's because of poverty. People are too poor to buy the food which is produced. And how does that happen? So as a think tank, we look into that. And we've been looking at this in the global south, in Asia, in Latin America, in Africa. We've been following the Green Revolution, which has purportedly saved 1 billion people from hunger, but less reportedly also sent about 1 billion people into the ranks of the hungry. And more, we're looking at hunger and food security in the United States, where we have close to 50 million people who are food insecure in a country which produces more food than any other country in the world, with the exception of China. We try to produce information that's useful to the people who are trying to improve our food systems. And so we work a lot with community organizations, with people's movements, farmers' movements, women's movements around the world, farmers' federations like Via Campesina, which is international farmer federation, small farmers. We work with the Community Food Security Coalition in the United States. And we try to amplify their voices, the hopeful alternatives which they are promoting and advancing on the ground. But we also try to provide information about the world food systems, which are useful for those movements, the people who are actually changing our food systems. And we also produce information which is accessible to the general public, and we have quite a lot of our materials are used in college courses around food and development.
Yes, and your website is foodfirst.org. Is that correct?
That's right, www.foodfirst.org. And you can find all of our publications there, our books, backgrounders, policy reports, briefs, fact sheets, and as well as sort of breaking news within the food movement.
So, so there's really sort of 2 segments to what you guys are doing, or more than that, but you could very broadly say that there's a critical aspect where you look at the present state of the food system and respond to questions as to how we got to this state, what's wrong with this state, but then correlatively, there's also discussion of options that can be taken to address, improve, transform the situation.
Yes, I agree. I would think there's also a third aspect because we have what we now call the corporate food regime, which is highly vulnerable to financial and environmental shock, and puts several billion people at risk, which is why we have about 1 billion hungry people, and many more billion are, and 2 more billion, nearly half of the world's population, are at risk of hunger and malnutrition. So we look at how that corporate food regime works, how it developed historically, and how it works. What are the rules of this corporate food regime, like the U.S. Farm Bill? Or what are the institutions which hold it in place, like the World Trade Organization or the World Bank? And who does that corporate food regime benefit? Like some of the larger monopolies, Monsanto, ADM, Cargill, whatnot. And then we look at the alternatives that are springing up, sort of like breaking through the asphalt of this reified corporate food regime all around the world, at the community level, the farm level. And so we look at sustainable agriculture, food policy councils, community-supported agriculture, agroecology. These things are happening all over. But then there's a third aspect, and we ask ourselves, if these alternatives are so great, why isn't everybody doing them? And so we look at what's holding these alternatives back. And that then sort of takes you into this very contested area about the rules and the institutions that govern the production and consumption of the world's food. And so it's really not enough to have successful, sustainable models of agriculture on the ground, and there are many. But in fact, you have to change the rules, and you have to change the institutions, because if you don't do that, then all of these great practices and alternatives will always simply remain alternatives on the margin of the larger world food system, and they'll never be permitted to gain ground and become the norm of a sustainable, healthy food system.
And in many ways, I think that third aspect is the most exciting. But before we highlight that, maybe we could just drop back a bit to the first, where you're talking about the vulnerability of the corporate food regime to various sorts of shocks. And a few years ago, there was a crisis in terms of a spike in food commodities, and that's recurring again this year. That sort of what you're talking about? And if so, could you elaborate upon those developments?
Yeah, precisely. You're referring to the 2008 food price spikes, which ushered in the food crisis at the time, and sent the ranks of the hungry way over 1 billion around the world. And that was, those prices came down a bit, but not to pre-crisis levels, and now they've shot up again in 2010. And we can expect this to continue to happen. Back in 2008, we had these, what people called food riots, something like 40 food riots around the world. Some were in places where you'd expect to find them, like Haiti, for example, or in sub-Saharan Africa. But some were in places where you wouldn't expect to find them at all, like Italy and Wisconsin, where there's plenty of food. And what we finally realized, that these weren't necessarily just food riots. In fact, they were food rebellions, because even in Haiti, you found that people were rebelling against an unjust political system, which was not working for them. Because at the time of those food riots, the food was there, but the government was incapable of getting the food to the people, and prices that they could afford. And so when people rioted, they didn't march on the warehouses where the USAID, food donations were kept. They marched on the National Palace, and they drove the Prime Minister out of office. And we're seeing now, again, this same thing, but with much more deeper and broader political consequences, because most of the rebellions now in the Middle East began around food, and were sparked by the rises in food prices. And people at first rebel against the high price of food, but then they rebel against a political system which is holding an unjust food system in place. So now in 2010, we're seeing, food riots again, but this time with very direct political consequences that we didn't see as much back in 2008.
So,
This is the result of 40 years of construction of a corporate food regime, which is basically unjust, which deprives people of access to the land and the seeds and the resources that they need in order to produce their own food, makes them dependent on a global market that is volatile. And it's volatile because there are absolutely no controls over the monopolies who basically control our food system, and no controls over speculation. So these sort of price spikes can happen at any time, and they can be set off by a drought here, or the rise in fuel costs there, or whatever have you. But in effect, these are only the proximate causes. The problem is the system itself, which is highly volatile. And so the combination of both financial and environmental volatility results in social and political volatility. And at the end of the day, it's the poor who suffer. And increasingly, the middle class are beginning to feel the pinch of this food system.
so as the conversation unfolds, on one level, this present question might seem something of a digression, but it struck me as an important point when you were talking there, namely the treatment of these questions, specifically in the American public space. I don't think the state of affairs is quite as bad as it was at one time, but relative to their significance locally, the food riots or the food rebellions to which you refer, I would say, received relatively minimal coverage in the U.S. media. And the role that food plays, say, for example, in some of the developments in the Middle East presently, uh, really doesn't seem to, in the coverage that I've seen, be adequately appreciated. To what degree is this an accident? Is there a level of almost conscious suppression of that sort of thing, or how do you see that treatment, or do you just not agree with how I'm framing the question?
No, I think, if we get back to understanding how the corporate food regime works, and so some types of information and some types of knowledge and certain ways of producing and processing and distributing or selling food are going to be privileged, and others are not. And they're going to be first ignored and then ridiculed and then fought against. So, for example, we have it pounded into us that people are going hungry because of lack of food, and that we have to increase food production by 70% by 2050. Otherwise, everyone's going to starve. Well, that really has to be unpacked, because we already have more than enough food to feed everybody, and yet we have 1 billion people hungry. So just producing more food isn't going to solve that problem. And this sort of fetishism, technological fetishism, that we need GMOs in order to increase food production because the world is starving, feeds right into this paradigm of the corporate food regime, that we have to be constantly increasing and expanding production on the basis of northern proprietary technologies. What this doesn't say is, one, what I already said, which is that's actually not the problem. The problem is not lack of production. The problem is lack of access to food. People can't afford the food. They're too poor. Or that they don't have access to food-producing resources like land, and water, and whatnot. But what this also ignores is why is this being pushed? Well, when this clearly is not the proper solution, and that was pointed out by the International Assessment on Agricultural Knowledge, Science, and Technology for Development, which was a 4-year study with 400 scientists, which basically said, no, we don't really need these GMOs. There are other causes besides low yields that are leading to hunger. And we're not even sure GMOs really will raise yields in the global south, where it's needed the most. The fact is that these monopolies, like Monsanto, like Cargill, like ADM, and also on the retail side, like Walmart, Tesco, Carrefour, they have made mega profits over these food crises. Every time there's a food crisis, their profits increase 20, 30, 40%. Mosaic, which is a subsidiary of Cargill, in 2008 saw the profits increase by 1,700% in one quarter. So they make a lot of money off the food crises. Then the problem is, what are they going to do with all these profits? They've got to be reinvested. You can't just sit on them. That's just not how capitalism works. And that's not how shareholders work either. So in order to return compound growth rates to their shareholders, these companies have to continually expand and invest, which means they have to break down other markets and they have to gobble up other companies. So you look at Monsanto, for example, that has completely saturated the seed market in the United States for corn and soy, and to a large extent has saturated the soy market for seed in Latin America and rapidly Asia. Where are they going to go? They've got nowhere else to sell. So they have to go and break open the markets in sub-Saharan Africa, because even though those farmers are poor, there's a lot of them. And even though the world economy is stagnating, the only part of the economy which is growing is the sector which corresponds to the poor, which is growing at 8%. Now, that doesn't mean the poor's incomes are growing at 8%. It means the number of poor are growing at 8% a year. So that's a market that Monsanto is very interested in. So now they have to convince us that they're the ones who can save the poor from hunger with their genetically modified seeds. But, of course, they need foreign aid in order to come in and develop the infrastructure and provide the fertilizers and the pesticides at subsidized rates so there can be uptake of their seeds. Now, that means us, the taxpayer. We have to foot the bill so that Monsanto can resolve its own crisis of accumulation, and it's got nowhere else to go. And that's what this really responds to. It's not because the people in sub-Saharan Africa need GMO seeds at all. There are many other alternatives to GMOs already working now on the ground. I mean, GMOs aren't going to be ready to roll out until 2017. So meanwhile, what are the people there supposed to do? Well, if you're talking about raising and stabilizing production sustainably, we have agroecological methods which are already proven on the ground and just need some support in order to spread. And this is widely documented. And there's a recent report from the UN Secretary on the Right to Food, the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, on agroecology, which documents the extensive areas which are under agroecological practices, which are perfectly productive, but which are not controlled by the monopolies, so they're ignored. The ISTAD, the study that I referred to, the International Assessment on Agricultural Science, Knowledge, and Technology for Development, has been summarily ignored by the World Bank, who originally financed it, because they didn't like the findings. And it's been ignored by the U.S. because they don't like the findings. And Monsanto and Syngenta and the others walked out on the report. They were part of the report, and they walked out because it didn't reach the conclusions which they wanted, which were the world needs GMOs, or we're going to starve. So I think there's two things here. One, this isn't a problem about production. It's actually more of a problem of overproduction in the North, and what to do with their profits and where to reinvest. They need the South, the global South, to reinvest as corporate monopolies. That's what this is about. Because if we're really serious about ending hunger, one, we would back land reform, so more poor people would have land. Two, we would advance these agroecological alternatives on the ground, supporting them in the way which we're now proposing supporting the corporate proposals. And three, we would do things like to level the playing field so that both countries in the global South could produce more of their own food and not be dependent on the volatile global market, and so that small farmers would have a better chance in the market itself. As it is now, they get killed in the market, and they go out of business. They can't possibly compete against subsidized grains coming in from the north, being dumped on their local markets, sold at prices below the cost of production. There's no way. So we have to change the rules, which means you have to take agriculture out of the World Trade Organization, for example. We have to allow countries to protect their agriculture and protect their farmers, as we do here in the United States. I think that there's a lot which can be done if we're really serious about ending hunger. The problem is because our global institutions and our governments are pretty much captured by the corporate monopoly agenda of perpetual expansion, we're unable to advance those kinds of policies.
And in terms of there's a general crisis of capital accumulation. It's not specific to the agricultural sector.
What we have to realize is that this corporate food regime is a capitalist corporate food regime. So it acts the way capitalism acts. And so it goes through cyclical crises of overaccumulation, and it has to destroy other markets and other firms in order to resolve its own crises.
So the ultimately it seems then what is it like this, that the difficulty in really forwarding alternatives to the corporate food regime involves forwarding alternatives that obviously contradict the suppositions of capitalism itself, which has been accepted as an adequate mode of economy by at least a significant portion of the North, and people just aren't really willing, I think, on the whole, to countenance that kind of challenge. Would you say that's valid, or?
Well, I would say that if you look at capitalism over time, it always goes through periods of liberalization and reform. They're two sides of the same system. Liberalization is when you liberalize markets, and we are now in a neoliberal era of markets in which you put no controls whatsoever on markets. And you can see tremendous concentration of wealth during these periods. And this is true for our food system as well, since it's a capitalist food system. And that's what we're seeing right now. Tremendous concentration of wealth in the hands of very few monopolies within the food system. But there always comes a time when you get a social backlash from this. Because if markets were allowed to run rampant without any controls whatsoever, indefinitely, they would eventually destroy the social and material basis, the environment, for the reproduction of capital. So at some point, there's always a counter movement in which there's a pushback from society, which forces the institutions of capital to institute reforms. Think about Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal, for example, and which is where we got tremendous reforms in our farm sector, and that came after the bust of 29, and basically in this country there was real problems concerning governability. I mean, people were in the street, they were out of work, and they were in the streets, and there were uprisings all over the place, and it was FDR was afraid not only was the U.S. government going to fall, but in fact, firms at the time were afraid that capitalism might fall. So you had all kinds of reforms come in. And, we're moving towards that again. Now, we're still very much in a liberal phase, and neoliberal institutions very much have control of our political agenda. And in fact, they're retrenching. An example would be President Obama tries to introduce, mild reforms into the healthcare system and just gets slammed. And so the reforms we get are actually, more neoliberal than anything else.
Or there's the
beginning to
present.
see, pushback on the ground, and I think that, manifestations of this, what's happening in the Middle East, you can find at a smaller level that same thing happening all through Asia, Latin America, and Sub-Saharan Africa, where people are pushing back because the food system is simply not working for them. This neoliberal food system and this corporate food regime are destroying their livelihoods and their possibilities for survival. I mean, look at the destruction of the small farm food system in Mexico and Central America, thanks to the North American Free Trade Agreement, has resulted in 5 million farmers from Mexico coming to the United States looking for work because we destroyed their livelihoods with that agreement. These things don't work sooner or later, and now they're up here, and now there's no work up here either. So these sort of contradictions will result more and more in pushback and political upheaval, both in the global south and more here in the north. And you look at what's happening in Wisconsin and think, well, what's that got to do with farming systems? Well, did you see all the tractors out in the street? And because the cooperatives in Wisconsin basically collectively bargain in order to get their price. And so, yes, what's happened to dismantle the right to collectively bargain directly impacts, family farmers and those in cooperatives that are an important part of our food system. So I think that you're going to see more and more this type of pushback, and people are going to become more and more receptive to alternative ways of organizing our food system.
What would you say are among the more promising alternative strategies that could be assumed?
Well, in a way, it depends if you're talking about the global north or the global south. I mean, in the global south, there was a study done at the University of Michigan, which actually was a global study. But it showed that in the global south, you could increase yields 200 and 300% using organic and agroecological methods of production. And this was a meta-analysis that looked at 300 different comparative studies of conventional and agroecological or sustainable agriculture. And the thing is that in the global south, many farmers, most of the farmers are poor. And they produce about half the world's food, but they're very poor and they don't have much land. And they produce at low levels, like 1 ton, 2 tons per hectare. Well, to double that, to get it to 2 tons or 4 tons per hectare, is really not that difficult if you overcome the limiting factors, which tend to be soil and water. There's no soil, so you have to build soil. And the water runs off because the soil is eroded. And so you have to conserve water. And if you conserve water and you build soil, add organic matter, you get huge increases in production and productivity. And that could, so agriculture could easily feed the hungry in the world by 2050. No problem. Now the problem is, can they hang on to that food? And they get the benefits from that extra production. And that's where you have to deal with markets. Because what's happening even today to a tremendous degree is farmers are producing food, but they sell the food, and they sell it cheap because they're poor and because the markets have been destroyed. And then, 3 or 4 months later, they're buying the food back, but this time it's expensive, and they can't afford it. So we also have to pay attention to markets. We have to protect farmers from the volatility of the global market. Now, in the North, it's a little bit different. Certainly, because we're producing at much higher levels to begin with, we're overproducing. We're overproducing both in terms of the market. We produce too much to consume it in the U.S., and we have to bust down markets around the world to get rid of it. What we have to do here is simply, rather than overproduce and allow the price of grains to drop down to nothing, which isn't happening right now. There's a good price for grain now, but it's so volatile, we know it's not going to stay there. Just pay the farmers a fair price. If you paid farmers a fair price, you wouldn't have to pay subsidies. If you insured them a parity price, a price which covers their cost of production and allows them to make a good living, then we wouldn't have to pay any subsidies. Now, the grain companies wouldn't be able to buy cheap grain, so they don't like that. And they wouldn't be able to sell cheap grain to the livestock companies, right? And so they don't like that either. Something like half of our grain goes to livestock. That's what this is about. It's not about feeding people; it's about feeding animals. And but that would all change. Meat would become more expensive. We'd have to eat less of it, and people would eat more grains, and we wouldn't be overproducing it. So that would be one big change right there. And in terms of more sustainable farming methods, if farmers weren't on this treadmill in which they have to overproduce in order to make a living, then they wouldn't have to be pumping their fields full of all the fertilizers and pesticides that they're using now, and they wouldn't need these GMOs. And we'd see a different opening and I think you would see agroecology and organic agriculture advancing much more broadly in the North as well. And we can produce almost at the same levels in terms of yield that conventional agriculture attains now. You can attain pretty much the same with organic, but it's more management. It's more work. The farms have to be smaller. And I think that would be a plus because we can employ more people. We could break up some of the larger corporate farms, and we could begin to dismantle the economic power of the monopolies. And if we dismantle the economic power of the monopolies, then we can begin dismantling their political power, because right now they've got Washington pretty well fast in their grip.
In one measure, in terms of because part of it is that there's a sort of relationship between the North and the South where you get this surplus production in the North, which is used to compromise markets in the South. So to what degree do you think that there are significant geopolitical calculations for which that occurs? In other words, it doesn't just occur because because big agro wants to make profits, and that's one way in which they can do it. Is there, or maybe there isn't this way, maybe this is an imagination, is there perhaps a desire to actually assure a domination of the South economically and so forth for extra economic reasons by the North?
Well, I mean, that's always been the case.
I know it sounds kind of obvious when you say it like that, I guess. But
it's always been the case. If you look at the origin of our food aid, Public Law 480, and you go onto the USDA website and you look at the original language of food aid, the very first objective of food aid is to expand markets in the global south for agribusiness from the United States. That's what it's about. So people don't like to say this out loud anymore, but I'll never forget when I was a kid hearing Hubert Humphrey, who was vice president back then, and in the 60s, and he's saying, people say that giving because there was an argument that we shouldn't give away food aid. Why should we be giving food to people? And he said, well, that'll make them dependent on us, and that's a good thing, because basically then we can tell them what to do. And this is in our he didn't say in our imperial interest, but you can very see that's in the interests of U.S. foreign policy. But I think it's very much one of these cases where the genie's out of the bottle, or Pandora's box, if you like. I mean, okay, that's food aid, and food aid today is basically controlled by U.S. grain companies. But now it's gone beyond that, because over the last 40 years, thanks to policies that favor overproduction in the U.S., and thanks to the quote-unquote free market policies, to establish the dominance of corporations in the global market. Those markets aren't free at all, of course, but the global market now dominates. And thanks to the World Bank and the IMF dismantling forcing southern countries to dismantle all their protections for their own agriculture, we've made everybody dependent on the global markets, and the global market is run by the monopolies. And so we're really caught. And now U.S. foreign policy, whereas I think is much more blatantly instrumentalized by the monopolies than it was before. I mean, it always was, but now the monopolies are bigger. Now we've got oligopolies where the monopolies basically connive, and the public is completely divorced from all those decisions. I mean, the good news is that all this is breaking down. It's not working well, and politicians are looking more and more hypocritical, and are unable to justify their positions and to a public which is increasingly unhappy, both with our foreign policy and with our domestic policies.
Well, I guess sometimes you say these things, and the impression I have is, well, who's going to disagree with that? Who does disagree with that? And what would they say?
You look at, we have about 50 million poor people in this country, and that corresponds to the 50 million food insecure people, according to USDA. Now, that's really the tip of the iceberg, because, in fact, the lower middle class and the people being bumped down the ladder of the middle class are also experiencing food insecurity, housing insecurity, job insecurity, and people are growing. Larger and larger sectors of the population are growing more and more unhappy. Now, this doesn't mean that this turns them into, raving progressives by any means. I mean, I think then there is a battle for hearts and minds between, very reactionary proposals with more progressive proposals and, redistributive proposals around our economy, our politics, our food systems. So it doesn't, just because people aren't happy, it doesn't necessarily mean we're going to go off in a direction of reforming the food system in a way which benefits more people or benefits the poor or benefits the corporations less. I mean, you can easily go in the way of much more reactionary position, which in fact tries to hold the power of the corporations in place. And so it's not a done deal by any means. I mean, I think we have a very long, drawn-out, and serious struggle ahead of us. And I think we're beginning to see the beginnings of that.
And we're going to close it up here momentarily, but I mean, just on that latter point, that there's a real struggle for hearts and minds. Where education and information fit into that? I mean, obviously, it's integral because it seems that many people get co-opted by reactionary movements who are actually uh, getting the bad end of the stick, as it were, of the policies actually advanced by the people they're supporting. So I would suspect if you look at lots of people in the Tea Party, they're actually pushing for policies that are going to damage their own lives. But is that? Do you think I mean, how is that to be remedied? Are these people? I mean, I think that people are very often deceived, and that there's just an incredible inadequacy in the general discourse. I mean, what do you think about that?
No, absolutely. And the problem is that, especially in the United States, we sort of have no historical memory. I mean, these things happen over and over again, but they're wiped from our memory because of the overload of useless information with which we're bombarded every day. I think the thing to keep in mind is that, so we have the corporate food regime, and it has two sides to it. One is neoliberal and the other is reformist, but they're two sides of the same coin. And both work to perpetuate the dominance of the corporate food regime. And then we've got a food movement. And the food movement also kind of has two sides. It's kind of the progressive folks that are out there doing the gardens and the CSAs and the farm-to-school programs and just trying to fix things on the ground, And then you've got kind of a more radical trend, which would be the minority in this country, but it's the majority globally, which wants real structural reform, land reform, economic reform, institutional reform. They want to change the corporate food regime in terms of the rules and institutions, because they know that the alternatives being pushed by the progressives on the ground will never get anywhere until we change the rules. So I think what the challenge is to really produce information which helps to inform and build alliances between the progressives and these radical trends within the food movement. Because because I think that will make the food movement stronger. And the stronger the food movement is, the more possibilities it has to actually push the corporate food regime, force it into reforms and even transformation. Now, the danger is that particularly the progressive trend is easily co-opted by the reformists from within the regime, and some neoliberals or reactionary from within the regime, either by giving money or by sort of obscurantist arguments and whatnot. And so to the extent that progressive forces in the food movement ally themselves with the reformists, it weakens the food movement and it strengthens the corporate food regime. And I think, there can be tactical alliances, but, strategic alliances, I think one has to be very careful about. And to know the difference between the two, we really do have to inform ourselves regarding the political economy of the corporate food regime and who owns what, who accumulates what policies really benefit whom, and should we really ally ourselves with. And so, that's one of the jobs of Food First, among other think tanks, is to work very closely with communities, but also have a very close trenchant analysis of the food regime and to be able to supply information which is simple and people can understand and people can use in order to build strong alliances to advance their alternatives.
Well, thank you very much, Eric Holt-Gimenez. I think I said your name correctly. If I didn't, I apologize. So,
No, you said it correctly, Tom, and thank you. And when will this program air?
it'll air Sunday night from 9 p.m. to 10 p.m. on WVQC 95.7 LPFM in Cincinnati or at WVQC.org. And I'll send you an email with the information here just after the show.
That'd be great.
So, but again, thanks again for being so generous with your time, and I'll let you get on with your day.
Okay.
So,
Well, thank you for your diligence and inquiry on these issues. I think it really needs more airtime.
so I wholeheartedly concur. So,
Okay.
have a good day.
Take care, Tom.
Bye. And that was Eric Holt. There was Eric Holt-Gimenez from Food First. Quite illuminating.